wanted me to leave my passport. I was like, no.
You're on mic now.
Oh.
Right, on that note, hi everyone.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming down tonight to the SMC panel. If you guys want to like come a bit closer, please do, because it's going to be like very informal, like very discussion based. We want like audience participation. We don't bite, I promise.
You can't speak for all of us.
Yeah. I don't bite. I don't know about the rest of the panel.
Turn my phone off.
Yeah, I did so.
Fab. So yeah, just a quick note before we begin, like if something does upset you or anything that's discussed, like you're welcome to leave at any point. It's very relaxed. No one's gonna like get annoyed if you leave. And we will have a short break in the middle just if like anyone wants to take a breather. So yeah, welcome to the SMC panel. Thank you so much for coming. Just a bit about Student Minds Cambridge, and then we'll get onto our lovely speakers. So yeah, Student Minds, we're a mental health campaign charity. We do quite a lot of different things in Cambridge, but basically we're trying to like help improve the like perception of mental health and like the treatment. I'm Alex, I'm the president. This is Sophie, our amazing events officer, who's organised tonight. But yeah, without further ado, would the speakers like to introduce themselves?
Sure. Okay, so my name's Johnny Benjamin, and I'm a mental health campaigner, writer, and I forget what I am, and a filmmaker. I make films as well. And yeah, I've got lived experience. That I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, like schizophrenia and bipolar, when I was 20, now 30. But most of my teens were spent hiding that. So yeah, lived experience as well.
Hi, I'm Adrian Garcia. I am currently the Commander-in-Chief of the Black Dog Campaign, which is a mental health campaign run by SANE, which is a national charity. I genuinely didn't choose that title, but I really like it. Again, I come to the mental health world as someone who has had various, but one very important suicide in my family, and sort of try to look at suicide prevention especially, but kind of also work across the board. I'm also someone who has personal experience of depression and anxiety.
Hello, yes, I'm Jonathan Wells. I'm a social worker by training. I've had a 35-year career of working in mental health services, many years in Cambridge Mental Health, and then in Hertfordshire. So I've had a lot of experience of the good and the not so good of what's actually on offer in terms of mental health care and treatment locally. I'm now sort of semi-retired. I'm a carer. I've got two sons in their 20s, one with Asperger's and another one with severe social anxiety. I suffer with depression myself, so I'm a bit of a sort of mental health all-rounder, I suppose you could say. So I'm heavily involved locally in trying to campaign for better mental health promotion, helping people stay well, but if they become unwell, better responses to that.
I'm Misha Fraser-Carroll. I'm the KUSU GU Welfare and Rights Officer, so that's Cambridge University Students' Union and the Graduate Union. And I'm also founder and editor-in-chief of a mental health magazine called Blueprint, which started up in Cambridge last year, and now we're expanding to different countries, different universities, not quite different countries, nationwide. And as Welfare and Rights Officer this year, I'm working particularly on standardization across colleges, access to resources, and intersectionality. And I've done a lot of writing and campaigning on intersectional welfare and just like an intersectional approach for mental health. And in my spare time, I write for The Guardian and GalDem, which is a magazine run and written for by women of colour.
Hi, I'm Rachel Kelly. I'm a journalist by background and a writer. I've also been unwell with depression. But the good news is I did get better. And I suppose I see my role now is sharing good evidence-based strategies about how to recover. And actually outcomes are quite good. And so that's what I've written about. I've written 4 books and I'm on my 5th book. My most recent book was about the links between nutrition and mental health and where the evidence is. But I've also written about what psychological strategies work and what physical strategies work to create a context in which you might be less likely to suffer from mental illness. So I'm maybe good news.
So just quick, thank you so much for joining us, because we're really excited to have such a talented and important set of speakers speaking today. So the panel today is going to be quite general, so we will have audience questions, and so there's ask anything really about mental health. But we thought we'd start just with kind of discussing stigma. So I'm just going to start with a very broad question of just what do you think is the biggest reason why stigma towards mental health still persists so strongly today? Or do you think it's still a big problem even?
I'm going to grab that.
Go for
That's
it.
okay. 3 years of working in anti-stigma, I think I've said these words like a million times. I think it's a huge problem, and it persists, and I often sort of get questions around, is it a little bit like the AIDS campaign? Is it a little bit like sort of LGBT campaigns, racism campaigns? And I'm just like, well, yeah, to an extent, maybe. But mental illness is invisible, and people don't think about it on a day-to-day. It's not about something that you can see and don't like. It's much more sort of, it's something that you can't see and you'd rather not see. So that's the kind of difference. And I think that, therefore, people just kind of don't take sort of so much care in how they talk, which is a lot of why I'm going around universities all over the country, and hopefully Cambridge soon. We've got Oxford, so let's get Cambridge as well. And it's, oh God. I think that when we live in a society where stigmatizing language is so pervasive and people can talk about, mental this, crazy that, or whatever, without, flinging these words around, or even just sort of reading a media article, like the recent Texas horrible, horrible stuff. It was the first thing that was reported was he had been in a sort of mental hospital before and had suffered with schizophrenia, and it's like, well, let's actually dig down into whether that's relevant or not and how that's relevant, rather than just labeling schizophrenia as this is the thing that's really connected to a violent person. So the result of it really is isolation, and my biggest thing that I do research around is almost every kind of mental health condition. The biggest problem that ends up is isolation. If you suffer with horrible anxiety, you kind of want to hide it from people. If you suffer with horrible depression, depression is almost defined by isolation. Things like schizophrenia, etc. You don't want to be known as this crazy person, and therefore you self-isolate, and you get this sort of self-stigmatization. And I genuinely believe, as I said when I introduced myself, sort of suicide prevention is one of my sort of number one goals, and suicide is a result of isolation. And I really think it's as simple as that. So yes, the stigma exists, and actually it's easy to get rid of. I do a workshop with a group of university students. That group is convinced, within about 10 minutes. It's not a difficult thing. You just kind of need the knowledge. But while it exists, this is why the suicide numbers are so high. This is why people are suffering so much. So that was a convoluted answer, but there you go.
I was just going to say, does anyone want to add anything to that? Well, one of the questions that we have is, what needs to change in our society before mental illness is completely destigmatized, or indeed, is it possible to completely destigmatize mental illness?
I think it might be difficult to completely do it, but we should certainly all aim for that. I hope to see... I think it has to be admitted that there's not full knowledge of what causes certain mental health conditions. So even perhaps because of stigma, the amount that goes into research about mental ill health is, I forget the percentage, perhaps 5% of everything about health conditions. So there is a lot that we all struggle to explain. Even the professionals. I think I'm one of the mental health professionals in the room, I suppose. I don't want to try and speak for them all. But a good psychiatrist will admit to not what he or she doesn't know as well as what they know. So there's a lot of sort of ignorance, there's just some ignorance there anyway, and into that sort of gap comes a lot of prejudice and all the rest of it, including, it's already been mentioned, self-stigma. Parents who have a son or daughter who's ended up being labelled with schizophrenia, whatever it might be, it's not fully understood what causes schizophrenia. So into that gap, parents will say, I'm a bad mum or I'm a bad dad, it must be my fault, which is and the amount of grief, a huge amount of grief and difficulty
I think
goes along with that.
you make a really good point. So if you go on the Royal College of Psychiatrists website and you look at what are the reasons for depression, which is obviously the thing I know most about, it will come up with 7 different possible reasons, which I think is exactly your point. So really, to defeat stigma, we need much better information, we need much more research, and we need much more clarity. And right now, the brain is still a very little understood thing. And as you say, fear and ignorance and stigma feeds into that. So I completely agree.
I think when I first did a course with MHFA, their sort of official line, and they're not wrong, but their official line is that mental illness is caused by biopsychosocial reasons, which essentially means anything.
Wow.
That's the most, that's as good as you get.
Yeah.
That's the most convenient catch-all. It doesn't really get you very far, does it?
Even on the Royal College of Psychiatrists, they have one thing which is unexplained. It's sort of spontaneous. It just seems to have come from nowhere.
And I would also argue along those lines, like especially looking at the social perspective, I think often the way that mental health and mental illness is conceptualized societally does take much more of an individualistic approach than like a social approach. And I think that is quite core to kind of the roots of stigma, the fact that it often is a you problem, what have you done wrong, or what biological kind of switch has gone off in your brain, where can we isolate this thing that is present within you, as opposed to acknowledging things like cuts to the NHS, or poverty, or race, class, gender, sexuality, like
Brexit.
all of these Brexit, all of these different social things
Exams.
that do impact on people's mental health, and also do affect the way that mental health and illness is expressed and is shown. And I also think a lot of that is partly rooted in like the medical model and viewing kind of mental health problems as something that needs to be found, diagnosed, and cured. But also like the fact that a lot of mental health problems have been historically conceptualized as intertwined with the legal system. So if you commit a crime, that is thus deviant, and that can thus be pinned to some sort of illness that we can find within you. And I think that's huge in terms of the way that we see stigma now. Often, I think some of the most pervasive stigma we see, particularly with things like schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, can be the kind of idea of danger, when really often danger to yourself is the biggest danger, not danger to other people.
I think I can't remember the stat exactly, but it was something like you're 12 times more likely to be a victim of violent crime if you have schizophrenia than you are to be the perpetrator of it. So that yes, violent crime is a problem with people with schizophrenia, but often it's people getting beaten up because they're sort of acting like a mental, or
I think as well, stigma is exacerbated in different areas. So, for example, the LGBT community, more stigma. Different cultures, more stigma as well. I'm from a Jewish community, and I'm gay, so there's kind of double, almost stigma, double kind of hurdles to get over. There was for me. But yeah, for sure, cultures we hear a lot. There's still a long way to go, I think, in different cultures to try and get rid of that stigma. And the Jewish community, actually, 10 years ago, we never talked about mental health, but finally, because of great work of mental health charities and organizations, and, rabbis coming forward and, and talking about it, it's finally being reduced. So, and that's what it is. It's the only way to get rid of the stigma, really, is talking and education. I'm sure we'll talk about education more, but that's the way, is education.
I think it's so true. I think often it's the sort of fear of the unknown that gets people, and even as a mental health sufferer, I think often the frustration comes from not really understanding what's happening, or why you're feeling this way. Hello? No? Oh, that boring. No, but yeah, and I think, on the topic of education, what more do you think we can do to educate people and reach all sectors of society? Because I think it is a problem that you have so many different groups, and a lot of campaigns will only reach one set of people.
One thing that I do think is massive is thinking about where the onus of responsibility lies in terms of education. So often we hear phrases like, we need to start talking about mental health. And whilst I think that's a really honourable kind of initiative and cause in itself, it's important to acknowledge that who are we talking about when we say we should talk about mental health? And more often than not, it's often directed towards like people who experience mental health problems themselves, and the onus is put on them to destigmatize and to sometimes share very vulnerable experiences that potentially could put them in danger, like in their own communities. So I think when we talk about opening up and talking about mental health, it really needs to come from all levels, not just the people who are most vulnerable.
I actually had an experience quite recently where I was doing a mental health workshop in Devon, and it was kind of a community thing, and I don't know if the other people on the panel who do workshops have experienced this, but sometimes a community thing where it's sort of a drop-in can become a little bit dangerous. And what happened was someone from an organization I won't name because I don't really want to blame them, but it's an organization that is against all mental health charities and against all psychiatrists and all medication and all everything. And they want to talk about mental extremes rather than mental illness, and they want to embrace it, etc., which at its core is not necessarily a bad thing, apart from the fact that their main aim is to go around charities and completely sort of jeopardize what they do and like ruin all of the workshops and stuff, so I didn't have a good time. But essentially what happened in this workshop, which I think is, like, your point is really important, is that she was saying so many things that were not particularly helpful, that everyone in the workshop, and I think many people who turn up to mental health workshops of their own volition kind of turn up because they've got some kind of lived experience, and everyone started talking about, well, actually, my depression is this, well, actually, my voice in my head is this, well, actually, this, and I think it's so dangerous to actually put people in a situation where they have to sort of out themselves. I think people should talk about it as and when they feel ready to. You know, there are a lot of people, including my esteemed panelists, who have been through a horrible situation and have therefore decided to actually share their knowledge. But to be in a situation where you're actually ill and you are being pressured either by one hugely irritating woman, or by society, or by media, or anything like that, to say like, okay, now's the time that you need to share your story. It's like, well, why? Why should I do that? And I would actually, I'd say the onus is on the government, and it's on Ofsted. I really think it is, and I'm currently campaigning Ofsted, and I just think, and I think I've discussed with both Johnny and Rachel, it's just like, by the time I was 6, I already knew what cancer was. I've been taught that by the time I was 6. I already knew that if you're in a really cold place and you start feeling warm, don't go to sleep because you're going to die. I know, but I don't go to places that are sort of below 6 degrees. I just don't do it. It's not like, Garcia, I'm from Spain. Like this isn't happening. So it's just like, well, why wasn't I told that if you feel really low for a long time, then that's actually something wrong?
So I think there are two strands, which are the educational strand, which is that you're quite right. People need to understand what mental illness is, given the caveat that Richard said that we are, Jonathan, that we're a bit in the dark about exactly what it is. So, and there's the sort of education around stigma and the problem. And then there's a separate topic around education, which is that clearly prevention's much better than cure. Turns out there's lots of good evidence-based strategies that children can learn really, really young. So I was with the Mental Health Foundation recently, which are basically the most important charity for research on mental health. They're the people who really know what's going on. And the biggest indicator of future mental health problems is how school-age ready you are at 5. And it's very easy to assess that in terms of things like sociability and there's other various indicators. So basically, mental health problems do actually start pretty young. And probably at least half of all mental health problems start and present in people's early teens. And if you have problems when you're young, it's a really good predictor of you're going to have problems as you're adult. So with this knowledge, it seems to me that we should be starting very young, much younger, I think, than actually government's talking about. We should be getting to children at sort of 5, right at the very get-go. And it's beginning to happen in schools, and people are learning some of the mindful techniques, which have got very good data behind them. And I think if we address this kind of prevention rather than cure, and started young and started earlier, there is some hope. There is some stuff we can do.
And this is actually why I think Inside Out is the best film ever. Because I think it's really important to take holistic attitudes to mental health, especially when you're trying to educate younger people. Because often people will say, oh, we shouldn't talk about things that are so harrowing or so difficult to talk about with children. But actually it's very easy to start a discussion about feeling happy and feeling sad and what
Yeah.
those different emotions feel like and how to be in touch with how you're feeling and what situations make you feel in different ways and what it might be like to feel one way for a very extended period of time. And I think it's kind of almost patronizing to imply that children can't understand, like even on a base level, those discourses.
And it's actually quite easy to do. I mean, as you said, Adrian, the thing is an Ofsted report, and unfortunately Michael Gove took out the requirement in the Ofsted report to judge schools on the pastoral care that they were delivering.
To an extent, unfortunately, Michael Gove works quite well as a sentence.
Well, I mean, i.e., if we changed how Ofsted judged schools and whether they were judged on the pastoral care that they were delivering, setting aside funding, we could actually change this.
To Rachel and Misha's point, I wonder, can you put your hands up if anyone in the room has talked about mental health in any way to an adult? Even just having a discussion. Cool. Anyone done it with children? What was the difference?
They were much more open. Baggage, or they had less fear.
And was that your experience maybe as well?
Yeah, I think when it's an adult who is like an actual someone who is in the field of mental health, it's slightly different. But say if it's just normal, I'll usually like play the glad game and get on with it. Whereas children, I remember one person said to me, "Well, that's okay. Sometimes you just feel like that," and that that whole childish attitude of that's okay. You don't need to hide that.
Yeah. It's like, my experience is, I have quite a big team of volunteers, so basically the stuff that I don't want to do, someone else does. But when things come in for the ages of about 9 to 13, I'm always just like, I'll make myself free. I really enjoy that age group. Because you talk about these kind of things, and they're really open, they're really kind of, oh yeah, I get you, because they haven't kind of been formed by society yet, and they're just kind of cool with it. With universities, I do workshops in universities all the time, and already people are at an age by 18 where they don't want to talk about it, and it's shameful, and it's whatever. Whereas children, I think, a lot of people, my dad actually runs a charity that is a bereavement charity, and everyone who gets up and talks in that charity is just I just want to talk to children because children are just blunt and honest with me. And I'm just well, maybe children are who we're all kind of meant to be, and we've been formed into this kind of misshapen human, and we should go back to that. That's kind of an idea that I've had for a while. I also just really like Disney, so can we all just watch Disney?
I completely agree that it should start primary school. It has to start primary school. Particularly at the top end of primary school and that transition to secondary school, no one talks about that. But, when we go in and talk to young people, there's a lot of anxiety around that. It can be really scary, that transition from primary to secondary. But I would love to see mental health embedded into the curriculum, so in things like history. Why don't we talk about people that had mental health issues? Winston Churchill, for example, was obviously the black dog. He's really open about that. But why do we never, when I was at school, we never talked about it there, or things like English. When I did Romeo and Juliet at school, I remember Romeo and Juliet take their own lives at the end of the play. We didn't talk about it. My teacher, she shut the book and said, right, it's your essay for this week. And I was just like, they've just taken their own lives. We're not going to talk about it. It just didn't make sense.
And we talk about that as a really romantic action.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make... If we could just embed it into the school culture and things like science, why don't we... In science, it doesn't make sense why we didn't learn about the brain. We didn't learn about things like, I don't know, maybe chemical imbalance leading to mental health issues. It just doesn't make sense. So embedding it into the curriculum, because it's not enough at the moment. In schools they have PSHE, obviously, and that's where mental health is usually covered. But we've spoken to so many pupils who say, well, the teacher just gets out a sheet of paper or does the slides, and we don't listen because it's the teacher, and it's such a missed opportunity there. And just doing it once in a school year is just, it's just not enough. We went to a debate on Monday in Parliament. It's the first time that it's been debated, should mental health education be compulsory within the curriculum, like, physical health education is. We do PE at school, to look after our physical bodies. So why do we not do something to look after our brains, our heads? So yeah, I'm completely with you in terms of Ofsted and Department of Education. It just feels like such a slow process. It's very, very frustrating. And we're seeing more and more, a real steep rise in things like anxiety and self-harm and eating disorders in terms of young people. So it's like, come on, we need this urgently.
I think even looking, I mean, if I go on a sort of personal level, like looking back at my school experience, there's so many things now that I could like explain. If I'd understood what mental health was, I could be like, oh, maybe I was feeling anxious, but at the time it just like, I didn't really understand it, it didn't make sense, but if someone had like taught me what it was, it just like makes everything make more sense. And I think it is that thing, it's like even, like you said, like uni students where you would think, you're meant to be open, you're meant to be like learning loads of stuff. It's that thing of like you put the stigma against, people put the stigma against themselves of like, oh, well, like I'm okay with it, but maybe other people won't. But like, so it does need to be that society level change where like everyone just grows up with it. So like in the same way you say like, oh, well, I'm going to the gym, no one bats an eyelid. But if you said like, oh, well, I'm going to a counsellor, there are loads of people, or people be worried that, lots of people would look and be like.
All I would add around stigma is that there just need to be so many initiatives at different levels to keep fighting away about this. I mean, down the road in Histon and Impington, the parish council have found money from somewhere to fund their own mental well-being person for their population, about 10,000 people. She just happens to be a social worker by background, that doesn't really matter. They had a whole week of events a few weeks ago, just about how we can look after each other, people's mental ill health. People were speaking up about their own situation. And to do things at that scale, for a sort of parish, basically, I thought was fantastic. And also, I think mental health professionals speaking as well, or mental health trusts can show a lot more leadership or speak up a lot more strongly about this. What I think's happened is there was this tradition that if you were a professional, you had to be 100% well, and then those other people, the patients, were very, very ill, and you didn't disclose anything about yourself. It sort of goes back to probably psychotherapy and that sort of thing. And people were and so there would be arrangements between the local mental health trusts that if you became unwell as a member of staff, you had to have a deal to be treated 100 miles away because it was all very hush-hush and what might everybody think. That's on its way out pretty fast, and actually a lot of trusts recognise lived experience as a positive. Someone might need their qualification as well as a psychologist or psychiatrist or nursing or whatever. But that lived experience as a plus, and people declaring it with confidence when they're applying for jobs. And they have a local project called Wearing Two Hats, which is at least, it's fine to have more than one label, whatever. So those things are happening, but for me, they never happen fast enough, and they never happen with enough force at every level of society. Really.
There's a wonderful little campaign that I saw that was, I think it was organised by Glasgow University. And to be honest, I didn't research it anywhere near as much as I should have, but so they had sort of posters in the bathrooms in the student union. And the tagline I just thought was wonderful, and it's to what you were speaking about. It just said, "Your therapist has a therapist, get over it." just wonderful.
Yeah.
I think it's on that societal level, what do you think about the media and their role that they play in stigmatizing or destigmatizing mental health, probably depending on which newspaper we're talking about. But like, what do you think the media can do to help?
That's a good reaction.
No, sorry, yeah. Because we were talking about it before, weren't we?
We
about
were, certainly, yes.
It's funny, particularly in terms of OCD, weren't we? What I was saying, things like OCD cleaners on Channel 4, yeah. It's like, what are you doing? It's very frustrating because, the media have so much influence, don't they? And they need to be so careful. My big thing with the media is around suicide and things like the phrase "commit suicide." I just don't understand why the media is still using that. You commit a crime, and that suicide was decriminalised, years and years and years ago. So why are they still using that phrase? And not just that, but things like when someone takes their own life. So many times they'll detail in the papers, the methods, and just go completely against the guidelines. It's very frustrating. Again, there still feels like a long way to go with that. Some media is getting better, but There's some newspapers, probably the ones that we're all thinking, that it's just they don't seem to care.
But I do think, even though I'll be ruder than Johnny about people like the Sun and the Mail and all of these people who I genuinely, if I could come face to face with some of the writers in those publications, I would not be very polite. But even sort of looking at things like the BBC and actually even like The Guardian, The Independent, who are two newspapers who really do write a lot of pro-mental health activism articles, you still get the whole, this person went into a school in Columbine or whatever, diagnosed with schizophrenia, 32 years old, blah, 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 and that's the first thing. And I'm just like, well, okay, but that's, to my mind, it's just like reporting like this person went into Columbine and shot a bunch of people, has blonde hair, feet size 11. How irrelevant do we want to go here? Because like, if the first thing you're going to do is their mental health diagnosis, what I want to tell you is that according to the Mental Health Foundation that Rachel was just talking about, it's not 1 in 4 people are going to suffer a mental health problem this year anymore. It's 1 in 3. Like, this is basically, if it's not you, it's your best mate. Like, it's getting to that level. So when something is so common and so complicated and so individual, why is it the most relevant thing to talk about when a horrible crime has been committed?
I really take both those points, but I do think that certainly the Sunday Times is campaigning hard. It has a mental health campaign. It's put its money and its reporters behind it. So does the Times. This is a big shift. I mean, having been a journalist, I was at the Times for 10 years. I mean, it would be unthinkable that a newspaper would choose to campaign on mental health. So I'm quite optimistic. I agree, there's a long way to go, and I think television usually lags newspapers, because newspapers sometimes have time to be more nuanced. But anyway, so I think there's a note of optimism there.
And do you think, I mean, you just mentioned that it's now gone from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3. What do you think that this rise is because of reduced stigma, so more people being honest, or is it to do with increased societal pressures? I think often that the sort of rising figures are what lead to like the famous like snowflake generation and things, which I'm sure everyone here like completely disagrees with. But like it, as a why do you, basically what do you think is causing these rising figures?
Oh, sorry, okay.
Sorry.
It's a big question.
I think there are, from my perspective, and I want to hear if you guys agree with me or not, but from my perspective, there are kind of 2 big things to think about. And one of them is every other article in the news. And as Rachel said, there is more optimism coming. I'm not just a sort of doomsday, everything is awful person. But we're lucky to have Rachel to remind us of the optimism. But I think that more and more people are talking, more and more people are reading about this, et cetera, et cetera. So more and more people are actually going to the doctor and being just like, okay, actually, this thing that I didn't know what it was, I've just realized that it's something that you might be able to fix, so can we chat? So there's that. I also think on the other side, on the slightly more doomsday part, and my other life is I work in social media software, so I don't hate social media, I promise you. But the fact that I can sort of take up my phone and I've got roughly about 4,100 data points on my phone within about 2 seconds of looking at it. So new text, new this, new that, new that. And I'm not even talking about cyberbullying, I'm talking about I have access to so many things entering my brain and so much information, new tweets, new news, new someone that I forgot to meet up with because I never put anything in my calendar, new mum saying, do you remember about dinner, new this and whatever. So when we're talking about sort of in the 1980s, for example, everyone can handle a certain amount of stress. And it's often talked about as a sort of stress bucket, and everyone's stress bucket is a different size. The fact that we've got this in our pockets, and the stress that it might run out of battery and we might not be able to get that information and it all kind of going around, it's obviously it's to an extent catastrophic for mental health, and I don't know how to fix that. I think social media can be very beneficial, but it can be pretty bad as well, and I just don't think, and there's Ruby Wax, who's a very famous mental health campaigner and broadcaster who has done a lot of work with SANE, and she very often will stand up and say, we are not designed to live in this modern world. Like, our brains have not caught up with all of this crap. And it's just like, yeah, like, I mean, like, if my phone runs out of battery, I'm gonna have a bigger panic attack than anything else. But yeah, no, I think you're right. I think like evolution doesn't go as fast as technology, and I think that's a really major part in it.
It's interesting that you also mentioned that it can have a positive effect. So I think we talk a lot about social media in that respect, or how addicted we are to our phones, for example, or how you see your friends having these wonderful lives on Facebook and Instagram, and then it makes you feel worse about yourself and your life. But I was wondering if any of you could talk about how you think it can be used in a positive way, or what the positive effects of social media can or should be on mental health.
I think in many ways, like, social media can be, like, very good for gaining solidarity for marginalized people in general. So, like, for example, I'm in a group that's called Mental Health for Queer People of Color. And, like, that's a group that has, like, 500 people in it. And how specific is that? Like, how many different identity labels do we have, like, tacked onto that? And yet, like, we found each other. And I think you do make very pertinent points about all of the kind of increasing demands on us, and the fact that we can never switch off, and the fact that, yeah, like, people can contact us at any time and we can access new information at any time. But I also think that solidarity, often I've seen it as, like, that's, like, the cost that I pay to gain, like, the benefits as well from social media. So I think it's very nuanced and complex, but I do think there are positives that could be taken away from it.
I think when you're in the middle of something, it's very hard to understand it. And a lot of us feel we are in the middle of some sort of mental health crisis, particularly for young people. And there's quite a few academics who are trying to think hard about what the hell's going on at the moment, or in the last few years. And I've heard people talk about this concept of overstimulation, which I think is sort of what you were referring to, and I don't really know any more apart from the fact that people are very interested in what that might mean for people's mental health. But and the other thing that I hear wherever I go, and I was in a room full of parents talking about their kids yesterday, and going around, and they all describe their children as suffering from anxiety or low self-esteem. So, and from the people I know, and my sons and their friends, and some of these fantastic kids, you know, they're at Cambridge, some of them, but they still think they're useless or hopeless, or they're not quite good enough, or they've done the wrong thing, and this extraordinary levels of anxiety and almost self-hatred. And I can't explain that, I don't know.
So
I just see it wherever I go and people I talk to.
I think the person who's really, really good about self-esteem, and if anybody's interested, she's absolutely brilliant. She's the person who really knows about it. She's called Christian Neff, N-E-F-F, and she's working in Texas. And she's been studying what has been the impact of a world, a sort of psychological belief in self-esteem. And basically what she's done is she's shot it down. And she said one of the reasons we're in such a mess with our mental health is that this was the sort of commonplace shibboleth that everybody had to have better self-esteem. And she reckons it's created the most mentally unwell and narcissistic generation of American students ever. Her TED Talk's been watched by about 30 million people. Cannot recommend it too highly. So basically, she makes several arguments against self-esteem, which is how we thought we should be looking after our mental health. So the first thing she says about self-esteem is it's based on comparisons with others. So my self-esteem is higher than your self-esteem because, back to social media, more people liked my Facebook post or retweeted my tweet. So it's always comparative, and actually it's a hiding to nothing. So even if you get your double first, it's only a temporary kick because you're going to be back in the competitive game, and your anxious striving is going to kick back in, and you're never going to be settled with self-esteem because it's always about where you sit in relation to other people. So that's the first problem, self-esteem. So what she says is that we have to really stress much more our kind of common humanity and how alike we all are, whereas self-esteem is based on differences. So in addition, she has a whole new way of psychological thinking. And again, I'm really optimistic. I think this will be the future. And she has put together really, really interesting research, really good evidence-based research about self-compassion. And the idea of self-compassion is that it's about cultivating a very different voice in your head, which is not the I'm not good enough voice, but I'm actually a gentle, loving, kind. And she has lots of exercises and meditations and using mindfulness to kind of retrain our brain. And the really really optimistic thing about our brains is actually neuroplasticity. All that means is that our brains can keep changing, and we can lay down new neural pathways, and we can find new ways of thinking, which is why mental illness is an illness, but it happens in a context, and we can change the context. So if you did nothing else, I would really watch Christian Neff. Can I just rewind? On these figures about how bad is the mental health crisis, I think it's really important to say that this is very controversial. We don't necessarily know for sure the numbers. Start, if you're interested, looking really carefully next time there's a news story about mental health stats. We're massively out of date. It's a huge problem. Most mental health figures, you'll have a look closely and they'll be saying this happened in 2012. It happened last week. We don't have recent figures. We don't have the money for research. We don't really know what's going on. A lot of, notwithstanding my love for the Mental Health Foundation, the 1 in 3, the 1 in 4. So that's the first point. The second point is that a lot of people not dismissing the importance of mental illness. They feel we're medicalising, what they say, medicalising ordinary sadness. We're medicalising all sorts of conditions. This is huge in America. The person to read is called James Davis. He's written the key book. It's called Cracked. And basically what it is that the way that people make money out of mental illness is drugs. So in America, you've seen the prescription drugs go from here to here. You take the diagnostic manual, which is what are the mental health conditions. It's basically gone from around, I look to you, perhaps know more than me, but it's gone from around 40 potential mental health conditions to around 750 mental health conditions. So I just tuck it behind your ear that when we're discussing the crisis and the epidemic, I always think it's worth having a touch of cynicism, not cynicism, but just to be very alive to the fact that there are other views about how bad things are. Have we made them worse by over-medicalising? Is it because we've dished out so many drugs, which is a whole other story? Of course they can be lifesavers. I've taken them for many years, and they can be very, very important. But there is another debate. So I just think, it's just, bear that in mind.
I think, yeah. Sorry.
No, I was just going to very quickly say that there can be sort of devil's advocate. I was talking to my dad about this the other day, and I actually got really pissed off with him temporarily. And then, he's a sort of Jewish lawyer man, so every time I'm pissed off, he's good at jokes, and I just can't not laugh. But I was kind of talking to him, and sort of the reason that I'm in this is that my little brother died having taken his own life, and we're kind of sort of joking around a little bit, but he just said, do you not think that all of these statistics, like the suicides going worse and anxiety going worse, whatever, is because everyone's reading about this in the newspaper and it's kind of copycat behavior? And I spent about half an hour wanting to strangle him because I spent so much time in mental health charity telling people not to think like that. And then I was like, Dad, you know what, I'm not saying that there's any data to back you up or that I believe you in any way, but actually it's probably good to open my mind to that as well. It's probably good to sort of be like, okay, what is the other side of the story as well? Because it's sort of complicated. And that doesn't really match Rachel's optimism, but it can be really complicated.
The real truth is I don't know.
No.
But I just think it's...
I don't think any of us know.
It is complex, and those things
it's just very complex.
are
I think that's what I'm
trying
to say.
The thing about the broad, where you draw the line, no one can draw the line between what is diagnosable as a mental health condition and where it ends. And certainly the drugs industry do their very best. I mean, there was an antidepressant 10 years ago, and they created a diagnosis to suit the drug. They had the drug first, and it was social anxiety or social phobia.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that is part of it. It is complex.
It's so difficult because it's not like there's a blood test or a scan. It's not like, for example, cancer, where you can scan and see that it's, it's so difficult. And I would say, we are so far behind in terms of data. In terms of young people, the last young people's mental health survey in the UK was 2004.
I know.
It's 2017, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
2017.
The ONS
and we
survey,
still, the next one will be apparently 2018, the next young people's mental health survey for the UK.
But when will it come out?
Yeah, exactly, 2094. So we are so far behind. But I would also, just to say, I'd also advocate. I can't speak today. Advocate, is that the right word? For self-compassion, and at the moment I'm having something called CFT, which is compassion.
I love it.
I love it as well. I love it.
What is it?
CFT is compassion-focused therapy.
Yeah.
And I've had quite a lot of therapy over the years, different types of therapy, but this is helping me more than anything else.
Totally agree.
Really, I mean, because I've never had self-compassion before, never. My self-esteem has been like so bad all my life, particularly when I was diagnosed and when, my mental health was affected. But now, through the CFT, through the compassion-focused therapy,
You see, that could be going to schools at 5.
Oh, yeah, can you imagine? It'd be amazing.
I think that's what, we have to hang on to some optimism.
There's a wonderful video I actually saw on TED the other day, which unfortunately, again, I can't remember the name, but I will try and email it to everyone at some point. There was a lady who was saying, a little bit sort of around the self-compassion, she was saying, the problem in society is not that Donald Trump is president. The problem in society is not that we're all at war. The problem in society is not that all these awful things are happening around us, because actually as humans, genuinely people don't care about anything that affects anyone that's more than sort of 3 connections away from them, or whatever. And I was like, okay, that's quite interesting. But she said the problem is that we build our homes inside of other people instead of inside of us. So we think we're being good people by loving other people. We think we're being good people by sort of putting all of our emotions and our efforts into others, whether they're friends or kids or loved ones or whatever. And she said that at the end of the day, you're going to wake up one day and realize that you never put anything into yourself. And I kind of watched that and I was just like, holy crap, that's me. But also that's so important because we're trained from children, we're trained to share, we're trained to be kind to others, we're trained that bullying is bad, we're trained all of this, but none of the stuff that you're told at primary school is be nice to yourself.
But remember, put your mask on and the plane first before you attend to those around.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
And I also think there's an important gender element to consider there, that there is a lot of there are a lot of messages that go out to young girls and I think women in general to be the nurturers, to be the carers, to be people who sit and listen and provide unconditional emotional labor to other people, and just something to consider in terms of gender, but I think it also can relate to race as well, just who cares for who and who should be giving to who. And I think it's very complicated. But to touch on just the point that you were making earlier, Alex, about what we do with the stats, I would just say it's really interesting seeing it from my perspective as welfare and rights officer, because so often we'll meet with the University Counselling Service or meet with the Students' Union's Advice Service, which is a really fantastic service that I think all students should know about, but none seem to actually know exists. But often they will say things like, people using the service have increased by 10% this year, which is fantastic, obviously. And I always question that assumption that it's fantastic, because it could be that far more people know about the services, or stigma has decreased and far more people feel that they're able to access those services. Or on the flip side, it could be that issues are actually increasing. And I think we can't necessarily know the answer to it, but it's really important just to raise that question in and of itself, that we don't know whether more people self-defining as having a mental health problem is good, or if more people accessing services is necessarily a good thing. But just important to question it.
That's very true around statutory mental health services as well, where at least they know what the demand is, and the demand certainly has increased hugely. I mean, across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough last year, only 10% of the people who were referred as needing specialist mental health care received it. 90% were sent home again with a leaflet or something. But as you say, there's quite a lot known about demand, but that can be for all sorts of different reasons.
And I think there's a huge misuse of statistics as well. I've been to genuine speeches where people have said things like, women are 4 times more likely to become mentally ill than men. Look at these stats. And it's just like, shouldn't this be a speech about how men don't talk about their own issues?
Exactly.
And it's like, you can use stats to basically say anything that you want. And as students with essay deadlines, I'm sure that you know that, because you can just grab any stat and just be like, that defines my point.
But if you look at that stat, you can often find that women are more likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety, but men are more likely to die by suicide. And that can, again, depends how you interpret statistics, but that can paint a picture that actually says men aren't accessing services at the earliest stage.
The classic difference is that women are supposed to be find it very difficult to talk about anger. And there's one theory of depression that it's anger turned in, and equally men find it very difficult to talk about vulnerability. So I always thought it was quite an interesting way to think of the differences, but you're right, there are real gender differences.
Or men get angry when women get depressed. That's another theory as well.
And people often say that men will act out, whereas women will act in. So women might isolate themselves or
Men
become
do
very low,
something, yeah.
and men might misuse drugs or alcohol or commit crimes. Different ways of presenting kind of the same issue at heart.
But I think it is really important because I've seen quite a lot of people who obviously have their heart in the right place who try and sort of completely take gender out of the equation. And it's like, why are we still talking about gender? It's 2017, etc. But it's just like, well, gender is actually something that, be it biological or society, that argument could probably last for about 17 hours and we wouldn't get anywhere. But like, the reality is that the genders are different, and the genders do experience these things in a different way, and I think that a lot of people kind of try and hush it up a little bit, because it's just like, no, you can't like talk about women and vulnerability in the same sentence because you're being a like patriarchal fuckhead. It's just like, no, but like that's not kind of what I'm saying, but it's important to recognize, I think. And I think the same goes with race. I think the same goes with sort of LGBT stuff as well. Like mental health is different and presents itself very differently in like all kind of different sectors of society.
Again, I think that links back again to schools and to young people and the messages that we're giving to young people. You know, we have a lot of conversations now about the messages we give to young boys. And, you know, when I was growing up, I was told, you know, because I was very sensitive, I cried a lot. And then got to a certain age and everyone was like, you know, big boys don't cry now. Come on, you know, man up. And that's a dangerous message to give. And this is why, you know, suicide rate in the UK, suicide is the biggest killer of men under 45. Because men are given those messages, you know, you've got to be strong and hold it in and, you know, put on this shield and, you know, so I think those messages are so important and we need to change those from a young age.
I think it is so, like, I think people almost try to do a one-size-fits-all approach under the impression that they're being, like, inclusive, but actually, like, we are all different and we all have, like, different races and genders and sexualities, everything, and, like, actually we do need to, like, start to, like, look at everyone as an individual when we're like treating mental health and like discussing it. And I think actually on that vein, like I guess we've kind of touched on it, but like why do you think minorities in society are more susceptible to mental health problems? And like why do you think this is?
I had a situation maybe about 3 months ago, and as a result I'm actually starting to work with a charity that sort of targets BAME children in East London. Because I did some workshops, etc., in a school in Barking where a very good friend of mine works as a teacher. And the school's a pretty mixed school, but I'd say it's probably about 40% black, 40% South Asian, and the rest sort of mixed white kind of situation. And we did workshops, etc., and I have no idea how it happened, and to this day the school has not explained it to me, but one of the parents got my mobile number. And about 3 days later I got a phone call from a lady of, I think, South Asian background, judging by the name, if nothing else, screaming like, "What have you been telling my son? How dare you? You can't talk about these things. You can't say that it's okay for him to say these things." And I was like, okay. And I started doing a lot more research after that into sort of this, and like, generally in communities, in my experience of Asian or African origin, and especially if religion becomes involved, it's a big no-no. And it's kind of very difficult because, and like Julian probably knows more than I do, but certainly like at least half of my family come from quite a religious Jewish background in North London. And again, like, you know, you live in London, but to an extent you're hidden away from certain things that London has. And for basically all ethnic minorities, you're hidden away from all of those people who talk about mental health, which is kind of difficult. I don't know how to fix it. There's a lot of ideas on how. I've been told that I should fix it through Jesus. I'm not sure how he's going to help out, but you know, if he's available, I'll give him a ring. But yeah,
From the perspective of a black person, I don't know. It's very difficult. I don't know the stats on necessarily. I think better or worse is always like quite a difficult question to ask, especially because there are so many different mental health problems that you can experience. There are so many different ways that we can play with stats, as we've talked about. But like we know that especially Black Caribbean people are more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. They're more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the cultural and historical stems of those things. So. I personally, and like based on some reading that I did throughout my degree, do think that a lot of stigma in Caribbean communities stems to the history of like the slave trade, and the fact that just as minorities in general in the UK, like they have historically had a harder time, and they have had to come up against racism, up against poverty, up against their histories being erased, etc., etc. And actually that narrative, like we were talking about with masculinity, that you need to be strong and you need to kind of get on with things and stiff upper lip and stuff like that, is very pervasive. And if you look at the roots of it, it does make sense that that would be pervasive. So I think possibly like as, I don't know, a society acknowledging those historical factors, acknowledging maybe the part that we've played in it, and acknowledging that like these communities do need support is one way to do it. Also thinking about things like cultural sensitivity in support services. So when we look at the fact that black people are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, is that because black people are more likely to have schizophrenia, or is that because doctors don't understand? For example, my family come from a Pentecostal background. It's very normal to say that you've heard God speak to you, which if you tell to an English doctor, they might think, okay, that's schizophrenia. So I think better training, more cultural sensitivity, and better representation are really important for improving those things.
I think, yeah, and more education as well. I mean, you know, I went to India last year, and I mean, I saw people chained up for having mental health issues. Really, it was really shocking, some of the things that I saw. And I went and I was talking about my own experiences and to psychiatrists and, you know, doctors out there, and they were like, they just couldn't believe it, because I said, you know, I've had that diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar, and they said, yeah, but you're here, you're talking, and you know, they'd never learned that actually you can learn to manage. They, you know, so because they just thought, no, the only way, you know, their life's over if they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So chain them up, drug them. I think it's so much is education, and you know, in other countries like that, you know, more pressure from. I don't know, countries like bodies like the UN. I think there could be more pressure, but doing it in a very sensitive way. It's got to be slow. You can't just go in there and say, right, you change this and change that, and you've got to, really kind of be really sensitive, I think, to the culture. But it's education. It needs education. I think a lot of it's fear. It's fear about the brain, and again, it comes down to more research and more understanding about the brain.
But I think there is sort of another side to it as well, because I was sort of reading. A friend of mine who lives in Cape Town was sending me some stuff, and it's by no means widespread, and I think it was very sort of small communities in sub-Saharan Africa that he'd managed to sort of research a little bit, where there are a lot of people who, from our terms, probably had schizophrenia, and from these small communities' terms, were gifted with an extra voice. And it was fine, and actually a lot of the research that was done by, I think it was MSF doctors who sort of went down and did some research, were basically saying, you know, schizophrenia more often than not comes with a huge amount of anxiety and depression, because schizophrenia is a horrible thing. Any form of psychosis is a horrible thing. So of course it's going to, you know, cause other stuff. And they're saying that's sort of the first time that they've actually met people who they would almost 100% diagnose with psychosis, who had no form of depression or schizophrenia, because within their communities it's just like, oh yeah, no, they see in a special way. And whether it's to do with anything spiritual or about gods or whatever, and it's just like, well, yeah, like, I don't think research like that would ever convince me that schizophrenia isn't an illness, because of the knowledge I have around it. But actually, you know, there are some attitudes towards it that maybe don't cause so much sort of problematic issue, basically, which I guess goes to the first question of stigma, because it did seem to be a community that completely accepts you. You sort of, yeah, of course you have schizophrenia, but it's not going to come with all the depression and anxiety that it would do in London.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well when you're thinking about, so we have a tendency now to equate mental and physical health. I think as an attempt to reduce the stigma, we talk about how, you know, if you have a broken leg, you go to a doctor. If you have a mental health problem, you see a doctor. So I'd be interested to hear to what extent you think that's helpful and what limitations it has, because obviously in that respect, it was helpful to see it not in the same way as a physical illness.
I think politically and sort of financially it's helpful. I mean, the term we've heard for the last few years is parity of esteem, and that's about funding within the NHS. And it's actually a statutory duty nowadays, in theory, to allocate funds appropriately into mental health alongside physical health. But it's still, even though it's a statutory duty, it's not happening. So
It was
the idea of talking...
2012, so it's since 2012,
Exactly.
and
Still
it's
not
been dire.
happening.
So.
And there are complex political reasons for that, which we can go into if we want to. So in some very basic ways, I think talking about mental health alongside physical health is really good. And also, of course, the other thing that around mental health is the horrendous statistics. I mean, we're quoting statistics, and they are important, but always have to have a little bit of a caveat with them. But there's the well-known one about people with severe mental health conditions having a life expectancy. What is it, 10 to 15 years
20,
less?
20 years less. So
20,
okay.
yeah.
This is 20.
20, yeah, hugely less than the general population, and that's absolutely horrific. And so the physical health of people with mental ill health is important, but that's slightly different.
Well, I think that to that point, I don't think you're likely to meet anyone with a severe mental health issue that doesn't also have severe physical issues, either in conjunction or because of. So it's almost irrelevant to talk about. I would say in terms of my role as an educator about mental health issues, especially to sort of children and young adults, it's very useful to compare something like schizophrenia to diabetes as a first off to let's really ingrain this. Once someone is at a point where they understand mental health issues and physical health issues, we'll go into exactly the discussion that actually I think all of us have talked about in terms of, the best qualified psychiatrists in this country do not know what's going on. So actually, the real difference between physical and mental health is not the fact that one is an illness and the other isn't. I think we've got beyond that. There are illnesses. The real thing is that we don't know about the illnesses in the brain, and there are probably as many things that can go wrong with your brain as the rest of your body. But then, is that being kind of taken advantage of by the medicine companies who are inventing 400 diseases per day, or that kind of stuff?
Yes, I think if you trace the history, so if you go back to the 17th century to Descartes, and so he split mind and body, and that basically was why the medical profession was set up as this split between mind and body. And I think it's no longer fit for purpose, and we should just get rid of it. We should just talk about people's health. I think it would revolutionise all sorts of things. It would help with diagnosis, so there's lots of mental health conditions with lots of interesting new research. So, for example, in my own field of depression, there's a lot of work around underlying low levels of inflammation, which is an entirely physical thing, and it's a new way of looking at depression. Really exciting research last week in treating schizophrenia, looking at it as an anti-immune illness. So first of all, if we got rid of this division, first of all, we change diagnosis, we could change treatment, we could help with stigma, we could change the budgets, which is split artificially between mental and physical. So physical health budget is ring fence, so when there are cuts in the NHS, the physical health budget gets protected and the mental health budget doesn't, and it's completely funded, it's looked at in a completely different way. And I think the time has come to rise up and say that's enough, we need to rethink, and it's health.
I'm sure in the future there won't be physical mental health, it will just be health. And, people will read back in history books and see, I can't believe they separated them. Because the brain's an organ, just like any other organ in the body. Yeah. I just don't understand why
mental has very unfortunate associations back to
Absolutely.
stigma.
The Cambridge academics have suddenly started talking excitedly about, they've realised that the brain is part of the body. So some of them are in the forefront of this immunopsychiatry thing. We all know that, well, I can't explain it in the right terms, but, the brain and the rest of the body all relate to each other every second of our lives.
And so in the field of nutrition, you've probably heard about this idea that the stomach is known now as the second brain. I don't know if you've heard that idea. Michael Gershon is the key professor on that, and he's absolutely brilliant. So in the old days, we thought the head ran everything, and there's a vagus nerve that runs from the head to the stomach, and we thought it was the head sent all these messages to the body. And it now turns out that the vagus nerve things send messages the other way. So when you feel stressed and nervous, you feel sick to your stomach. Well, that's because your stomach is as active as your brain. And this, again, will revolution. And it's already happening. In Israel, I was recently working there. And if you see a psychiatrist in Israel, you see a nutritionist at the same time. And that's because, basically, you've all heard about gut health and all this sort of stuff. That's because there's huge links between digestion, the brain, the gut-brain axis, and I'm sure all this is familiar to people. It's so exciting. It's so exciting. And there's stuff you can do. Omega-3s, really exciting research happening right now on depression. King's College London, they're supplementing people with omega-3s, people suffering from mild to moderate depression, and having better outcomes with omega-3 supplementation than with antidepressants. How exciting is that?
Absolutely.
And this is all about a revolutionary new approach. So I think it's going to be really exciting.
I was talking to my GP literally about 3 days ago because I went to essentially pick up some more anti-anxiety medication because I don't like flying. And he just started like kind of swearing at his computer. And he's quite a sort of elderly Bangladeshi man, and I really like him, and all of his other patients really don't like him because he's grumpy, but I really like grumpy people. I just want to hug them. I'm a weird person. And he started shouting at his computer, and I was like, what's wrong? He was just like, this stupid, like, I have to put in your diagnosis before I can get the medication, but I can only find anxiety in bloody mental health section. And I'm just like, what? And he goes, well, I don't know, I'm old, I don't know how things change, but you have a heart condition, not a mental health condition. Your brain just isn't helping your heart, but it's your heart that's the thing that's going wrong. And I'm just like, how interesting. Like, you've been a GP for like 60 years, and you're just like, no, just because your brain isn't helping your heart, the thing that's wrong is your blood pressure and everything else that's happening. And I was like, I don't agree with him medically necessarily, because we need to sort of factor in adrenaline and cortisol and dopamine and all the other stuff that's going on, but I'm just like, I quite like that people are shouting against the status quo, because the status quo clearly isn't right.
I think on that note, I was going to say, any of the audience want to ask some questions? Sorry.
I can say, I mean, we can all probably say a bit about that subject. It seems the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder seems very prevalent from my experience locally and nationally. So again, I don't know if that's because it's really a bigger problem or it's just a more attractive diagnosis. And I think, as we've already said, I think the level of understanding of people who are described in that way, the psychiatrists who I know best locally admit to only a partial grasp, really, of what they're talking about. I don't think it's, I mean, the government paper called No Longer a Diagnosis of Exclusion around personality disorder came out, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. But there's still, there's a problem around the term personality disorder that most people recognize. I'll mention my son, I won't go into detail because he doesn't like me to, but he's had social anxiety for many years. He was recently discharged from the local mental health service, no different from when they first provided him with care. And the letter came back saying, we've changed your diagnosis, you don't have social anxiety, you have something like socially avoidant personality disorder. I mean, if you go, the subtypes of personality disorder, as you may know, are very complicated. If you go on the Royal College of Psychiatry website, the subtypes are described one way. If you go onto the the British Psychological Society's website, they don't even use the same term. So emotionally, people say, well, he said I had borderline personality disorder. Well, now I've been told I've got emotionally unstable personality disorder. Well, they're the same thing, really, but it doesn't help. You know, people use it. I'm rambling on, but it's still a very contested and fraught area. There are, as you probably know this. You know, there are some, in terms of what NICE recommends as treatment for people with borderline personality disorder. There are some particular psychological therapies that work pretty well, dialectical behavioural therapy, for example. But in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, they estimate there are 6,000 people with BPD who need treatment. They treat 200 a year. So that's the side. I guess coming back to this demand versus... Those are just some thoughts from me, but it's a big...
I think also, just to sort of follow on from that, we if we are going to talk about mental illness and personality disorders as separate things, which I think we shouldn't, but for the purpose of the next sentence I say I will, if we think that we do not have enough research into mental illnesses, personality disorders have it so much worse. There is literally not one doctor in the country will say the same sentence about BPD as the next one. And I think it's kind of heinous. And I also think the other side of it is part of the reason that we've got a lot less statistics and a lot less information around BPD specifically, but also things like any sort of emotional personality disorder or even sort of narcissistic personality disorder, is if there are to be sort of ways that you can tell that someone has that particular condition, a lot of those things that you might notice in someone's personality are the same things that will stop them going to a doctor. And it will be sort of the difficulty of communicating with other people, the difficulty of understanding that they might be in the wrong, the difficulty, there's so many different things, but there's just not enough research. And I think I agree entirely with what you're saying.
I think, it's incredibly stigmatized and misunderstood. I think conditions such as maybe depression, anxiety, we've got people speaking out about them, but more and more people are speaking out. But borderline personality, I think, and I think partly, just the name, personality disorder. Just, I know very few people that are willing to actually stand up and say I've got BPD. So yeah, I think that's a big problem. The whole language, the terms are just emotionally unstable. It really frustrates me. You have, I've been told, I don't know if it's true, but I've been told that the way that they decide this, they all sit around a table, all these...
There's 6 or 7 of them.
6 or 7?
Yeah.
And they're sitting there smoking, drinking. Oh, should we call it this? Yeah, let's just call it that.
Or often it goes back some psychiatrists, I forget who, at one point, probably in 1890, thought that people who presented in that way were on the borderline between a psychosis and, I don't know, normality. So they come up with this word borderline, and it's just stuck there. It doesn't help anybody.
But it's very telling of how much discussion and how much money is put into mental health / personality disorders versus physical health, because calling that something like borderline personality disorder comes from exactly the same place as calling someone in a wheelchair a retard. But we've got rid of that word so many years ago, and I think that's a really sort of telling thing between the two kind of places.
Just to add, the work I do locally is about supporting other families and friends of people with mental ill health, and more than half have someone in their family who has the label of borderline personality disorder. Quite often, if they can afford it, they've gone privately to get that diagnosis. But the trouble is they then are sent away with the diagnosis. They'll go online to try and understand it, and as I've already said, you get totally mad. And what are they meant to? As a family, let alone the individual themselves. What are they meant to do next?
When your son got that letter, was there any information with it at all?
I asked. No, I didn't. I was I'm much angrier than he was. He just doesn't seem bothered about that sort of thing. But I asked if one. But my question for other people was, what do you have to go? Presumably, you're treated for anxiety, and it doesn't work for whatever reason, in quotes. And then if you fail for long enough, you then you get labelled socially avoidant personality disorder. It basically means we've tried to sort you out, it hasn't worked, so we'll just give up and give you that label, which means it's up to you.
What was it just?
A friend of mine who's a doctor, who again I will not name, because that's unfair, I was asking, just like, okay, well, in the context of a hospital, what is the difference between a mental illness and a personality disorder? And they said, well, a mental illness is when the doctor still thinks they can heal you, which is, that makes the whole process of diagnosis, in my mind, completely useless and morally unjust.
Yes. Well, the least you can have is some hope, you should have is some hope in terms of your recovery journey. That's the bottom line.
I think one of the really important things in my mind is, and I think I've talked to Rachel about this quite recently as well, is the subject of recovery. and what that actually means. And I think I often, sort of in workshops and in speeches and stuff, will represent sort of, if you can sort of imagine in front of me a sort of an x-axis of mental health, where sort of that way mental health is going well, and that way it's sort of going towards mental ill health, and then sort of well-being on the other side. So we're sort of separating the idea of happiness and sadness from mental health and mental illness. But a lot of the time, if I'm trying to visualize it in my head, if we're in this quadrant, or this one, anyway, if we're in the quadrant that is low well-being and low mental health, a lot of people sort of want to say, recovery is that sort of diagonal line to high well-being and high mental health. And I'm just like, well, no, actually, real recovery is probably coloring in the whole thing, because it's like, I think everyone on this panel will agree, it is a bit of a journey. But what we're kind of aiming for is probably a vertical line up. Like, a lot of people will keep their diagnoses for a long time, but that doesn't matter. So this is coming back to the point of comparing it to diabetes or something like that is very useful. That, that person is still ill, but they're fine. And the kind of recovery line, I think what we need to do is recognize that recovery is a position that someone is in when they can actually lead their normal lives and be happy and do whatever. And actually, what does it bloody matter if I suffer with anxiety if I can control it?
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that recovery isn't linear, and also that recovery doesn't necessarily mean the symptoms that you were experiencing go away. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Hearing Voices network. The whole foundation of that network is the idea that actually hearing voices can be very distressing for some people and can be hugely disruptive to going about your everyday life. But some people find it something that they can actually make peace with. Some people find it something that they actually find pleasurable, and there are ways to reconceptualize things and come to terms with things that might never go away. And some people, I was just talking to my friend actually who has BPD, and she was saying how it's something that she's come to terms with, and it's something that she knows she's going to live with for the rest of her life. And for her, that's what recovery looks like.
I think we don't talk about management enough, managing your mental health. Now I've got a toolbox of things that I've picked up, along the way to help me manage my mental health. But when I was first diagnosed, it was like, this is your condition, these are your medications, and go away, kind of. And that was it. No one talked about managing your mental health and recovery and hope. And those are really missing, I think, within the mental health service.
Cool. Any other questions on the floor?
I guess on the note of recovery, what do you think of the term being recovered then? What does that mean to you? Does that mean just managing? Do you think there's a possibility?
Well, the way I put it is just living life to the full. In other words, with or without symptoms. That's people get. I don't know what it is about mental health and language, but we have a real problem with language and mental health. And the number of people. The word recovery has been around in mental health for 10 years or more now. But the number of colleagues I've had at work who still struggle with what it means. Sometimes I think let's just get rid of that word and start it afresh. But for me, it just means being able to live life to the full, with or without symptoms.
I think it's also important, and actually, Jonathan, I completely agree with you. Recovery is such a problematic word. But then if we were to get rid of it, then it might look like no one can recover. So we're between a rock and a hard place. But I think we're talking about recovery in a way that sounds a little bit like you're always going to live with your mental health problem for the rest of your life. And I think it's also important to understand that that's not true. Even something like psychosis can be a 5-minute hallucination that you experience and never experience again. It can be that short. Or it can be your whole life with some form of psychotic illness. And it's sort of very individual to everyone. With something like depression, it's pretty common for it to come back and go again and come back and go again, but most people with depression, they would use recovered maybe in the way of saying, I actually don't feel those symptoms anymore. I might relapse in the future, but I had a really bad couple of years, and now I'm better. Someone with anxiety, certainly like myself, I'm just like, I drink a lot of chamomile tea, and I breathe a lot, and I've got beta blockers for when it gets really bad. So I'm kind of in recovery because it doesn't stop me doing anything. Hopefully, I will stop needing to do that because anxiety is a bitch. But so it means a different thing to every individual person. And I think also where recovery can mean so many different things, illness can mean so many different things as well. So it's just and this is part of the reason I genuinely think that the government doesn't put anywhere near as much money in. The government puts, God knows, I think it was 15 times more money into cancer than it does into mental health. And I'm just like, but we haven't started researching mental health. We should have so much more money in the infrastructure to research it. But I think also the difficulty of the research, and people like the Mental Health Foundation, people like MQ, even sort of saying to an extent in the work they're doing in Oxford, the research is so difficult because no two people have the same story. And no two people even have a similar story. So, like, what do you do?
Yeah, I think it's really key to acknowledge that recovery does look very different for different people. And for some people, they might see it as something that happened and then went away, and some people might see it as something that they've come to live with. But I think it's also important to kind of problematize the term in itself, as we kind of have been doing. But the idea that it suggests that there is like illness and then this threshold that like you can reach, and once you've got there, that's what recovered is, and that's just the absence of illness, when like above that there's wellness and like a whole new spectrum of like feeling positive as well.
Absolutely.
And I think often we conceptualize like illness in general, but often like mental illness as being negative symptoms, and not being mentally ill as having an absence of those negative symptoms. But actually, I think acknowledging what's above that line is really important, and important for prevention as well, acknowledging when you're feeling good as well as when you're feeling bad, and the things that you can do to actually be better than just okay.
I think I always felt a lot of pressure from people around me, not intentionally, in terms of recovery, and people would say to me, "Oh, so you're recovered now, and you're all better now, and you're fine now, and you're cured now." And
even something like "how are you feeling" can
What's
be,
that?
even though like phrase like "how are you feeling" can be a little bit pressurizing. It's like, do I have to tell you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is, but I think now I've learned to kind of say, no, and I'll never be cured. First of all, I'll never be cured. I've got to manage it. I always have got to manage it. And so I think people do sometimes feel, that pressure from other people maybe around them to be recovered. But it's a spectrum, isn't it? It's a spectrum, And like you say, 5 minutes you might be one way, and then the next 5 minutes it's different. But it's a spectrum, and I think people need to realise that.
So talking about pressure from other people and from maybe your friends and your family, what do you think are the best things that people can do to support someone with a mental health problem, and what would you say are things to avoid maybe saying or doing?
Listen to them.
Listen.
Yeah, I read a
Proactive listening.
I read a Guardian article. They do a column called "A Moment That Changed Me," and they did one that was one of their most popular ones ever, which was a moment that changed me when I listened to my suicidal wife, and it was just about a husband whose wife had been feeling suicidal for a very long time, and he'd always tried to be a fixer and always tried to say, you should just do this, your life's not that bad, and kind of telling her things. And he said he was described one day when actually he felt very overwhelmed and very tired and didn't have any energy other than just to ask questions or just to sit and listen to what she had to say. And he said that was a really pivotal moment where he realized that actually listening and asking questions, it's kind of the foundation of counseling and psychotherapy, can be so much more useful than trying to tell someone the kind of objective facts that you see as fixing their problem, because it's more conceptual than that.
And sometimes there's nothing to listen to because people might not want to speak, and then I think it's just important to be available there to someone. Because a lot of what I do nowadays is about families and family pressures and grief and all the rest of it. We had a local psychiatrist to a session like this, with us recently, when he was asked a lot of questions about that, and he just said, well, keep hanging in there, be available, and if there are a few things that you do together, even if you both like, I don't know, watching The Apprentice or something, just keep doing that and see what that leads to. And that doesn't sound like very much, but you've got to just keep
and
something
maybe
going.
just think that it's an illness, and if your friend had flu, you might bring round a fish pie, and you might unload the dishwasher, and just do all the sort of, practical things that you do when someone's not very well. Sometimes it doesn't have to be too complicated.
I think I was talking to someone recently, and I really liked the way that she put it, because for me, depression, especially when you're talking about things like suicidal ideation or anything like that, it's kind of about hope. And the way that I normally talk about suicide is it's when hope has completely shut the door, like no more hope, and then that's kind of where danger lies, basically. But sort of, a couple of people have said to me, just like, yeah, I have friends who ask me if I want to go to the pub every single day. And when I'm well enough, what I say is, please don't stop asking. I won't come, but please don't stop asking. Because one day, that ray of hope in my life will actually be big enough that it might come. Even if I just come for soda water. Like, but just please keep asking. Which I think, it is the listening thing. It's the making sure, almost sort of, there are cartoons that I've seen. I really like memes and cartoons and stuff, but like, there's an amazing cartoon I saw someone shared, I think it was MQ, Mental Health Research Charity shared, where this guy was sort of turning up every day and just putting his ear on the table. And just like literally a physical ear, and it's just like, that's the important thing. And that's what I mean by the phrase sort of proactive listening. It's not just like listening to someone when they talk to you, it's making sure that your ear is available. Because one day, the sentence might come out their mouth, and I think that's the most important thing.
I think, yeah, patience around those people, and perseverance, but in a gentle way, not in a kind of, come on, we have to talk about this, we have to talk about, you know, we need to. No, patience is so key. I know with me, you know, I lost friends along the way, you know, because, you know, eventually they stopped asking me out because every time I would say no, and they were like, well, but you wouldn't do that if someone had something like cancer, would you? You would be patient, you would wait for them. And the same needs to happen for mental health. I know with my parents, you know, when I first was diagnosed, I wouldn't talk for years, to be honest. And so my mum, she used to, and she still does, cut things out of the paper for me, like, I'd be like, oh, you know, there's Stephen Fry said this about mental health, or, you know, Ruby Wax said this, and I'd be like, I don't want to know. But, you know, she didn't give up on that. She kept on doing it, or she would read books on mental health and say, oh, you know, there's this book I read, and gradually it kind of, you know, it broke down my walls very gradually, but it took a long time, and people, I think, need to have that patience. It's so important.
And just adding to that idea about things to ask, I mean, locally, Minds have been running a suicide awareness campaign for the last year or two. They have little badges that you can wear which say, I'd ask. And what that, you know, it's deliberately, you think, well, what precisely does that mean? And what it means is if you're with a friend and they're really low and depressed, be someone who will say, well, have you ever thought about ending it all? People are terrified of asking, of saying
100%.
It can be a huge relief to people to be asked that question. There's this myth, I mean, others will know it, that, oh, I mustn't mention that idea because it might put it into their head. Well, there's no evidence for that.
It's it's one of the first things that you learn if you go on any sort of mental health first aid courses or anything like that. The sort of first thing is talk about suicide.
Okay.
Because the sort of the worst thing that can possibly happen is they say, no, I haven't been thinking about that. Why the hell would you accuse me of that? But the other option is you've actually given them it's putting the ear on the table.
I was asked by my GP, and I wasn't feeling suicidal, but I was just so pleased that she had asked. It was good practice, and it was great.
It would never put an idea in someone's head, and I think that's like a general rule, is that
someone who's not thinking about it is not going to think about it because you've
Yeah.
mentioned the word.
Sometimes.
And yeah, that also goes for like asking further questions, like, oh, okay, so if you are feeling that way, to what extent? Have you made a plan, or is it just like a fleeting feeling that you've had? Asking someone if they've made a plan is never going to make them make a plan. And so I think that's really important, because I think not talking about things like that can just perpetuate the taboo surrounding it.
And you need to put yourself in a place, if you do think that someone might be in danger, that you need to actually carry out risk assessment. And how can you possibly carry out risk assessment when you don't have that information? And that person, like, the isolation that someone who might be suicidal is feeling is something that they are very likely to be desperate to get away from. So if you ask that question, actually you're helping in so many different ways.
Do you have any more questions from the audience? Yep.
I also had a question about recovery, say from mid to low level depression. You spoke about organizing the mind, the brain, and keeping the idea of hope alive within yourself. My question is, from the wealth of your experiences, are there any life philosophies that can kind of help the mind stay sane? For example, I learned a lot from Eckhart Tolle, who was a philosopher. He believed
I love Eckhart Tolle. I love that book. And obviously that's at the heart of mindfulness, the idea that if we can be in the present moment. So a lot of anxiety is we're worried about the future and we're projecting into the future, or we regret the past. Whereas if we can learn to be more present, and actually Christian Neff's work is also a lot about accepting difficult things in the moment, and the very fact of accepting them in that moment can diminish them and help. I suppose I like poetry and literature, and I love the great lines. And when I was really ill and in hospital, I liked a line from the Bible, and it says, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." So when I feel unwell, I always feel that my strength will be made made more perfect through being so weak, if that makes any sense. So that's my personal. I hang on to that line.
I think there's a lot to be said for and against, to be fair, of the sort of appropriation, for lack of a better word, of a lot of sort of more Eastern cultures, sort of ideas around it, especially the ideas of sort of meditation and Buddhism and yoga and that kind of stuff. I think that there's a lot of East London hipsters took that over and now it's super popular. And I think that most people who actually come from places like Nepal or Northern India where these things are practiced will say, yeah, you're doing it wrong and it's complete bollocks. But having said that, if people are going to group together consistently and have a space where they can think mindfully for an hour in the morning and actually do something that's healthy for their body, I think that it can only be a good thing. And there's no psychiatrist or psychotherapist who's ever said to me, don't do yoga because white people do it wrong. It's always sort of being able to be still and think about your life and be mindful. If you've got an instructor who actually encourages that, that's a really fantastic thing. I'd also say sort of there is danger in my mind in the sort of healthy foods sort of society that has come up. There's a lot of people who seem to be very like, I only do kale and I only do this or whatever, and it seems to be sort of, I only shop at Whole Foods, but I'm actually really unhappy. But if you do it properly and you actually think about what food's actually doing to you, both sort of gut, stomach, mind, etc., there's a lot of wonderful people, including esteemed Rachel Kelly, who has written a wonderful book, who actually go forward in terms of, there's a culture here of what we put into our body actually affects it, which is something that I think a lot of us ignore.
I think kind of going back to the concept of self-compassion, because it's been so powerful for me. You know, the book by Kristin Neff, it's called Self-Compassion, isn't it? It's a workbook, actually, and it really kind of opened my eyes. And just being kind to myself, you know, when I'm struggling and when I'm in despair. And now I say to myself, well, would I say that to a friend? If my best friend was going through exactly the same thing that I am going through right now, I would not say the things that I say to myself to my best friend. And so I try and, just trying to change the way I speak to myself, I think has been really key. And just, doing things like every day, writing down 5 things that I liked about myself that day. Things like soothing touch, you know, giving myself some kind of soothing touch. It might sound a bit, but for me, it's really helped, Because I think the way that we speak to ourselves, particularly when we struggle with our mental health, can be really, really negative. So learning some self-compassion and self-kindness, I think, and self-forgiveness, I think is really important. You know, forgiving yourself when you're struggling. Because again, if you something like a broken leg, you know, if you had a broken leg, you wouldn't be half as hard as yourself as you are if you've got a broken brain. Learning about some self-kindness.
I also think that I reckon most people will sort of listen to someone saying something like what Johnny was saying, just like say nice things to yourself or do this stuff and just find it maybe a little bit kooky or something. But like one thing that I would really recommend that all of you do, next time you have a tutorial or a lecture that you think you're going to find really difficult, or even an exam, stand outside for 30 seconds in Superman pose, like full on, like, you know, like that, legs apart, like, and just sort of whisper to yourself, I'm going to kill this, like this is going to be awesome. And I guarantee you're going to come out of that tutorial and just be like, whoa, that went way better than it normally does. And then you will start believing that actually talking to yourself in a different way really helps. I work as a professional in sales, and I genuinely sort of vaguely hide the fact that I do it because people would judge me, but before I go into meetings, I do a sort of more subtle version of that, and those are the meetings that they actually sign the bloody contract. It really does work. So that kind of sort of talking to yourself, and not talking to yourself in the sort of general sense, but in terms of how you actually address yourself within your mind is so important, and you will see a really big difference, and it's really easy to practice.
It feels fake at first, for sure.
Yeah.
But the subconscious really, it takes, if you're negative talk in your head, the subconscious takes that on. If you start talking to yourself positively, even though you it may sound weird and you don't believe it, but the subconscious is listening, and then, there is a change, for sure.
Yeah.
I also like, final thing to add to that, I also like just treating myself and like my behavior and like the things that I do as like kind of a science, which I guess is partly sort of the foundation of CBT, but like the idea that I will check in with myself after going somewhere or seeing someone, how I'm feeling, and eventually you start to kind of work out what things make you feel good and what things don't make you feel good, and use that and apply that, and it does actually seem to work in really weird ways. And sometimes you learn really obvious things like, wow, if I sleep 8 hours, I actually feel amazing the next day, which seems like something you should just know off the bat, but sometimes when you try and test it and actually observe it like that, it can be really useful and you learn things. I think someone had a question.
I think probably be our last question. Go for it.
I personally, and I don't think there's a right answer to this, but if there is a right answer and someone corrects me, then I'm happy to be wrong. I'm personally very much of the kind of nurture and early life experiences can be a huge thing in sort of meaning that mental health issues and sort of illness can come later in life. It does seem to me, from what I've read and from what I've experienced, that a lot of the passing on of mental ill health can be, rather than to do with direct genetics, can often actually just be, I've been brought up in a household with mentally unhealthy people. So, like whatever behaviors and whatever maybe lack of connection with the child that parents can give can actually therefore cause a kind of chain of events. So the question, if I'm right in believing that the majority of cases could be something like that, the question would be answered is basically how do we stop that loop? And how we stop that loop is actually by looking after people with mental health issues and trying to make sure that that doesn't happen and putting enough money and resources in that direction. But that might be quite simplistic, so...
Well, all I would add is, I think, say with something like schizophrenia, the typical way you try and find out about genetics is, you're lucky enough to find some identical
Twins,
and then, they're brought up in different places, and you just see what happens to them, and if they, I'm not describing that in a very technical way, but that's basically how you investigate how strong the genetic factor might be, and from what I know, people generally conclude there is a genetic element, but they never conclude that it's 100%, it might be 40% or something like that.
Biopsychosocial, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in other words, I don't know anything about genetics anyway, so I can't see that there's anything about genetics you can do to sort of prevent, well, if it's only present, has a 40% influence,
Yeah, that
doesn't
my
take you
understanding, it's quite mixed, the genetic research. It's certainly not all mental health conditions. There's definitely, people think there is a genetic link on schizophrenia. They don't think there's a genetic link on depression. I mean, it's moving around. I think there probably is on bipolar, some kinds of depression, but not others. So I think back to research, we're still quite in the dark. Then there's the whole, as you say, the epigenetics. So do those genes get switched on? My understanding from psychiatry, and I'm beyond my pay grade really, but what I do understand is because there's so many possible factors that can lead to mental illness, so back to those 7 possible factors, even, you might think, oh gosh, I can't escape my genes, but because it seems to be so much of an interplay between a variety of different factors about whether that mental illness comes on or doesn't come on. So I think that's kind of maybe a hopeful message, and as Adrian's saying, it depends if a child is brought up in that household, if we can help those people who are suffering. So I don't know if that feels a bit more positive rather than feeling like, there's nothing I can do, it's just genetic.
No, I think the most important thing is to talk about it and address it, but not make too big a deal out of it. My dad's had prostate cancer, and because he's had prostate cancer, there's a much higher chance that me and my brother will also have, and we know that. But you
can do things.
We can do things, and me and my brother we're going to get our tests, the PSA test, the blood test, to see if a much earlier age now, and we know about it. We know there's things that could be done. Same with there's been a lot in the news the last few years about kind of things like breast cancer, and Angelina Jolie obviously
had that gene or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So prevention. We've got to talk about prevention and talking about it with young people, and not being afraid to go there with young people and talk about it, and but talk about it in a positive way, and look at things like mindfulness, with young people. And things like self-compassion or CBT, actually going in there, if you know that, the parent, if there might be a high risk of a child, then actually going in there with the child and not being afraid to, address it. I think that's really important.
I think especially with children, waiting for a child to come and talk to you means that you've waited until it's too late.
Mm. Amazing. Well, I think unfortunately we have run out of time. I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to all 5 of our speakers. Honestly, thank you so much for coming down and doing this. And also a big thank you to Sophie for organising this. And thank you guys so much for coming. I really hope you enjoyed this. Keep an eye on the SMC page for an exciting announcement coming soon about a new project, actually a couple of new projects. Yeah, big, big thank you. Thanks, guys.
It's hurting your ears, it's really hurting.